But we're, Park and I are going to be talking and giving you, we hope, some good, local examples about how we've used and worked with organizations on using conservation easements to protect scenic values. And in case there's anybody who doesn't know about the Piedmont Environmental Council, the group I work for, it is a 9-county nonprofit, and it has been around for almost 50 years. Next year's our 50th anniversary. Our mission has been to promote and protect the natural resources, the rural economy, the history, and the beauty of Virginia. And I want you to just kind of hear that. That's been in the mission statement from the very beginning. We're also part of the Journey Through Hallowed Ground, which is a national heritage area linking Gettysburg to Monticello. And I throw this slide up only for the sense that oftentimes when we're talking about what we're doing with conservation and scenic easements, we're really focusing things that are seen during the daylight, but we are one of those dark sky places. And some of what we do with our easement work actually also protects the beauty of the night sky. So an increasingly rare commodity and something I'd love to see more of us talking about. So why does protecting visual values actually matter? Well, it's actually an important economic and tourism driver. If you just look at this poll, people put a high premium on simply driving along a beautiful scenic byway or going through a pastoral rolling landscape. So what we see matters. We're visual creatures, and it matters to us kind of aesthetically, spiritually, and economically. This was a poll that was done of the Shenandoah National Park. This number just astounded me, though I guess it really, especially from folks out west, it probably is not that astonishing. But the visitors, when they were asked what they were doing up there on the Skyline Drive in the Shenandoah Park, well, 87% of them were not coming to hike. They were coming to drive the drive and go to the overlooks. So what should we do about that? If scenic value is important, well, we're glad you asked, because we started thinking about the value of conservation easements to protect the views from the park. So you see in the dark green, these are lands that are going under conservation easement to put them in permanent protection. I sort of assume that everybody on this call and at this conference knows what a conservation easement is, but just in case you don't, it is a legal agreement between a landowner and a government agency or a nonprofit organization that puts permanent limitations on future development of the property in order to protect its conservation, historic, and other values. What I love about easements is each of them is really unique. They really depend on the needs of the landowner, the specific features of the property, and because they confer a public benefit, there's also sometimes a charitable deduction. And Parker has some really great examples of very specific ways easements have been used for scenic protection in the Richmond area. So easements not only can eliminate or limit the number of subdivision rights you have on a property, but they can control signage, cell tower, ridgeline protection, the sizes of houses and other buildings, the siting of houses and other buildings, forest preservation. The list really, goes on pretty extensively. And because we've been talking about views, you can also use a viewshed analysis if you're an organization that's trying to figure out, you don't have all the money in the world, what are the most very critical places that need to be conserved. This again is the Shenandoah Park to the left in this screen. And this is a scenic road that goes up the east side of the Shenandoah National Park. And the red areas were identified as if you have limited money, those points are the most highly visible from the scenic road. So that's an example of a view from a road. And again, viewpoint depends where you stand. Here we've got our little figure in the schematic, our little figure standing off on the left. And that's what the view is. What is the visible to that person? That is their viewshed or viewpoint. Now, to date, Piedmont Environmental Council, along with a lot of other partners, including the Virginia Outdoors Foundation, the Civil War Trust, have placed easements on some over 400,000 acres in our 9 counties. Now, that may not sound like a lot to folks, particularly, again, if you work out west, but it's about 20% of our privately held lands. And I want to take a look just very quickly at the evolution of conservation easements in just one county. This is where I live, Albemarle County. It's where the city of Charlottesville is located. It's University of Virginia. And as you can see, in 1975, we don't have a lot of easements going on. Easements are the little dark green blotches. We have one state designated scenic river. Virginia had passed enabling legislation for conservation easements back in the 60s, and PEC was a really early in advocate for easements, but there really wasn't much of a financial incentive at this point. I do think it's interesting that the early legislation in Virginia talked about one of the public purposes behind easements was the enjoyment of the driving public. So from the very beginning, what you see does matter to conservation work in Virginia. Here we go, 1980, a few more have popped up. Notice we're beginning to see some scenic road designations. Here, more scenic road designations, extension of scenic rivers. And here you go, even more are beginning to come into play. And I will say, by the way, that PEC worked on all those scenic road, or most of the scenic road and river designations, because it became for us an organizing principle, how to get people to care about what's in their backyard and take steps to protect it. But a really big initiative we did was to work on forming rural historic districts. So you see in the light brown, 2 rural historic districts. One's in Orange County and surrounds the home of Madison, James Madison, and the other's the Southwest Mountains Rural Historic District. If you're not familiar with rural historic districts, they're not that different really than historic districts in cities. It just happened to be in rural areas. They were authorized under the 1966 Historic Preservation Act. And they talk about really the purpose behind them is to identify, evaluate, protect America's historic and archaeological resources. When they try to define historic rural landscape, the definition in the National Register is pretty wonky, but it's kind of like any place people have been or might have been or have impacted. But mostly they're looking for concentrations of historic structures. And in this case, the organizing principle was really linking this landscape of James Madison to Thomas Jefferson. Now see what starts to happen. Here you go. The tax credits, both federal and a state transferable tax credit, come into being in Virginia, and you have an explosion of conservation work till you reach the most recent years in 2020. And we now have over, and you notice another rural historic district to the south of the county. We have over 100,000 acres in permanent conservation in Albemarle County alone, which represents about 25% of our private land. And our PEC's goal is actually to go beyond the Biden 30-30. We'd like to see 50% of our lands permanently protected. So, oh, here we go for 2020, sorry, there you go. So I want to take just one part of the landscape and focus in on it, and it's the Monticello viewshed. Viewshed, as we said, is kind of what you see from a certain point, whether it's the observer's viewpoint or surface area that you're looking towards. It's not, it's kind of a wonky definition, but it works. And the purpose of designating viewsheds, I think we all realize this as scenic, is to really bring some attention to them and to figure out how to protect those scenic values, either through things like conservation easements or through public decision-making process, like in land use planning, zoning, and other things. Monticello started talking about the importance of view back in the 1990s. And I should confess, I used to work for Monticello, which is why you're getting to hear all about Mr. Jefferson's home. Monticello, you may recognize this. This is the house that's on the back of the nickel. It's also, as I said, Thomas Jefferson, the President Jefferson's home. And it was the home to 800 people who were enslaved and made that plantation possible. It is on the World Heritage Site, and it's been run by a nonprofit since the early 20s, which is pretty remarkable, and has about 2,300 acres. And it's really a stunning piece of architecture floating in this Virginia Piedmont landscape. On one side, it's surrounded by the city of Charlottesville, and there's those Shenandoah Mountains there in the west. Now, this is not Charlottesville. I'm going to pick on Fredericksburg, Virginia. This is Route 3 in Fredericksburg, and this is what happens when you do not protect the scenic value of important sites. This is over here, if I can see that church steeple, this is a historic structure, this is a Civil War monument. This is a really important Civil War site, and it has been totally lost in a sea of asphalt. And that's what we didn't want to have happen to Monticello, even though it was perched up there on top of that little hill. So here's Charlottesville. This hill off to the far left is Monticello. We're going to talk about this hill in a second too. And what did we do? First, we did a view shed analysis. So we wanted to be able to say what was important, what was not as important. And this was done pre-GIS, the old Ian McCarty overlay school. Then we made a case for why views actually matter, both for tourism, but also just kind of aesthetically for the entire community. And we put that comment about how views mattered into every single planning document we could insert it into. I am getting to easements, by the way, I'm getting there. And we hammered home the fact that the economic value of views actually really matters, because it does matter. It's incredibly important. So I mentioned, you know, for Monticello on one side, we had the city of Charlottesville, and there are some opportunities for conservation easement work in that view towards Charlottesville. But the real opportunity at Monticello was this, what we called the sea view, this looking over the Piedmont of Virginia towards the coastal plain of Virginia, with the next highest point being Portugal. And some of the land that you see right from this view, we actually took about 5,000 acres of that was placed just last year under conservation easement. So conservation easements, historic easements, that there really are, you know, really good strategies here for why you should think about using them to protect important scenic values. I bring up the fact that in Virginia, and I'm sure it varies state by state, I know it does, but there's a number of different state agencies and a number of also nonprofits that can actually be the stewards of easements. And the public purposes behind these easements can really vary. I wanted to show this. This is Monticello up here. This piece of land is about 250 acres, and it was owned by Thomas Jefferson's father, Peter Jefferson. And it has on it an extremely restrictive archaeology easement. It only allows it for some interpretive signs, a gravel parking lot, some trails. It had really strict protection here along the river bank area, you know, no cut. And it also had really strict, you can't see it very much here, but this is 250, which is kind of one of the big entrance corridors over here to the city of Charlottesville. So this was our attempt to not have happen on this entrance corridor what we'd seen happen in Fredericksburg. This is a schematic that just shows here's all the different pieces of land that Monticello owns. And I only bring it up to say we have tons of different easements, different easement holders. Each one of these pieces of land was written in a different way because there were different scenic values or historic or archaeological values that were being protected. And here was a happy moment with me years ago holding a sign with Rex Linville from PEC celebrating the protection of this a really important farmland that Monticello looked down upon. But I want to tell you very quickly another story about scenic protection. And here you see Monticello over here to the right, city of Charlottesville, Shenandoah Mountains. And here's this property called Mount Alto, the big mountain. And you know, why did that mountain matter? Well, Jefferson himself had actually bought that hillside in order to protect his own view from Monticello. He was thinking about it that long ago. And this view, here's Monticello, here's Mount Alto, actually was significant to the city of Charlottesville historically. People have always talked about the importance of those two hilltops. There you go. And it is one historic structure on the top of it right there. And here's Monticello down there. And here's the view from the lawn at Monticello. And here's the view from Mount Alto back to Monticello. The land was unfortunately not owned by the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, but had been on the market, 250 acres for $24 million. And we thought, no idiot's ever going to buy that. But unfortunately, some idiots started getting really interested in it when the price dropped to 15 million. And you saw the opportunity for just a couple of McMansions looking down on Mr. Jefferson's home, you know, could be maybe very valuable. And so with PEC's help, Thomas Jefferson Foundation actually bought that hillside and placed it under easement. So that was a really happy moment. And it's a no build, no nothing. You know, that view will always stay the same. There you go. This is from the gardens at Monticello. And since we are at a river conference, I can't help but also just reflect back that we did also through those easements protect the Ravenna Scenic River by putting restrictions on any clearing along the wooded banks, also protecting Jefferson's canal path and other historic features along the river like an old mill. And PEC continues to really diligently work on protecting this view through the biggest tool being conservation easements. I'm going to switch gears for a second as I kind of go towards the end of my program, and I'm going to tell a completely different story about conservation easements, and this is set out in Montana, what we call the Go Big or Go Home story. We were part of a 310,000 acre land purchase there, but we'd started working in Montana, and I was the state director for the Nature Conservancy of Montana from 2007 to 2012. And Nature Conservancy had started in Montana with just like a little sprinkling of preserves, but really figured out quickly that it was going to be very difficult to protect areas just with these scattered preserves. You have this amazing iconic wildlife and this biodiversity and this amazing landscape and these waterways. And I just have to, because it's Montana, I got to run through some charismatic animals just really quickly. It's been a long conference for you, so just bask in nature here for a moment. Here we got our elk. I would call this a medium charismatic. Our wolverine, our marmots. We're going to be talking about grizzly in a second. And just for the cuteness factor, I had to put my micro charismatic megafauna. But we realized that we were going to have to work not at these little tiny preserve scales, but we were really going to have to work in really large landscape conservation. And it's work that really matters, because when you look globally at what's still intact in the world, in the lower 48, this part of Montana is one of the last big pieces that we as Americans can have an influence on. So what did we do about it? I'm just going to take one part of Montana to focus on, and that is the Rocky Mountain front. And you may have also heard this referred to as this whole 10 million acre complex as the crown of the continent. There's also been a big initiative for years now of the Yellowstone to Yukon, which is even more than 10 million acres. And why does this matter? Well, it's an ecologically incredibly rich place. The grasslands just surge up to those overthrust mountains. And we started our work out in the Rocky Mountain front, we being the Nature Conservancy, at a pine butte at the Swamp Preserve. And we bought this land and then we put it under easement ourselves, because you have to lead by example. And we used it as a way to educate visitors. But we also used it as a way to be able to talk to our neighbors about the value of conservation easements. And now, while our driver was really trying to protect important habitat for grizzly bears, they're kind of our indicator species. When they do well, many things do well. What we really found out is that, and why this ended up being so important is that we were really aware that we're kind of one of the last strongholds for grizzly in the United States. This is their historic sphere of where they used to be. In fact, the last grizzly, I love this fact, was killed in Texas in 1890. And here is their hold today. And I would say that actually over exaggerates it now. I don't think we're seeing any of them in Idaho or in Washington now. It's really the last stand is that area in Montana. So we cared about bear habitat, but what did our landowners care about? What did our neighbors care about? They owned a lot of this land. It's cattle farms right against the mountains, and it's wheat farms and ranches further to the east. And in talking to the ranchers, we're trying to figure out how they can live with wildlife, but also keep their ranches and their farms going. But many, many times when we talked to them, what they really talked about was they wanted to keep the feel of the front. They wanted to keep that sense of place. They wanted it to look like it looked now 3 generations from now. That is what they were interested in. So while a lot of our easements ended up being about bears, they talked a lot about the scenic qualities that they wanted to see protected. So once again, we were able to use conservation easements working with them, not only to kind of set aside corridors for wildlife migration, but we were talking about building location, setbacks, stream retention, keeping, not building on ridge lines. We talked about oil and gas extraction and cases where the minimal rights had not been severed, where we could place things so they wouldn't visually intrude, put limitations or completely excluded signs and billboards. So I was just really shocked to be someone mostly focusing on biodiversity, but coming time and time again to the scenic valley being so important. So not a lot was under conservation easement in 1996, but here is how it progresses over the years. And you can just see these just incredible partnerships of getting these lands into permanent protection. So the ranchers, you know, they've got their way of life. We've got our grizzly. They've got their way of life, protecting their farms and ranches. And all of us benefited by providing a buffer to the scapegoat, the Bob Marshall Wilderness, and the entrance to Glacier National Park, some 200 miles in length. So, you know, what we see and what we save for future generations to see really does matter. And that is my not so brief story. I am done.
Thank you, Kat. That was fantastic. And my name's Parker Agelasto. I'm going to follow you, but I've got to admit, as I begin to share my screen, my presentation is not nearly as colorful as yours, with all of the wildlife and the wonderful, cute pictures of bears. And what was that little animal that was eating the flowers?
A pika.
So, okay, pika. So I'm going to simply say for the presentation that I'm going to follow up on Kat, I'm going to be a little bit more wonky. I'm going to be in the weeds a bit more on specifics with conservation easements. I'm also looking at a very different landscape. I'm looking at an urban and suburban and sprawling landscape, not dissimilar to Fredericksburg that Kat was referencing earlier. I also would like to simply add that for those of you who have never been to Richmond, we are sad that you could not be here in person this year. We were very much looking forward to having the 50th anniversary of the Scenic Rivers program in Virginia and hosting you. But this is the Richmond skyline that I am showing you here. We are a region of about 1.3 million people, formerly the capital of the Confederacy, but a lot has changed in Virginia to the good. And right now there is quite a bit of focus and attention on equity and social justice, environmental justice in our region. However, to segue from where Kat has been talking a little bit about Monticello, I wanted to start off with a little bit about who we are and get into some history of conservation easements and the scenic viewsheds. So as I said, I'm Parker Agelasto. I'm the executive director for the Capital Region Land Conservancy. We also serve 9 jurisdictions surrounding Richmond, which goes from very rural to very urban. And we have protected over 12,000 acres and hold more than 20 easements today. Our mission is to conserve and protect the natural and historic land and water resources of Virginia's capital region for the benefit of current and future generations. And I think it's very important for this conference that we highlight water. Water is a very important water resource natural resource for us to protect, and we connect it to the land. I think Kat already went into what a conservation easement is, but I want to highlight one provision within the state of Virginia's code, and that is that it has to be specific values that are being protected within a conservation easement. And those can be natural or open space values. They can also be agricultural, forestal, recreational uses, enhancing air or water quality, preserving the historical, architectural, archaeological aspects of real property. Now, within this definition, we do not see the word scenic, and that's okay. Scenic technically is defined under open space. So when we talk about open space, think we are talking about scenic as well. So when we talk about scenic values of a conservation easement in Virginia, there are several of these areas that in Virginia, as long as you are protecting one of these categories, it's kind of a safe harbor, knowing that the conservation values meet the state and federal guidelines. And the safe harbors include state scenic highways or byways. They include both the state scenic river program or rivers that are designated as wild and scenic rivers or American heritage rivers. They can also be lands that are visible from public parks or public hiking, biking, or riding trails. So as Kat mentioned, views from the Appalachian Trail, the Blue Ridge Parkway, etc., as well as lands that are officially designated by a local, state, or federal agency. So I want to just segue from from Monticello to Mount Vernon as probably being one of the best known examples of the use of scenic conservation easements. And in this instance, the view from Mount Vernon is what is being protected, the view that George Washington would have known across the river. And therefore it is one that really is expansive. And so I show you how those easements have worked both to create a national park system as well as private ownership and private conservation easements for the view from Mount Vernon, which is located up here where it says mansion. This is all in Maryland. Mount Vernon is of course in Virginia. And then through their viewshed analysis, they also determined which parcels needed to be protected in the future, which posed the greatest threat. And they determined this based on much of the same type of viewshed analysis that would be conducted and where tree canopy is helping to shield and buffer development. So that's a great example of where conservation easements have been used for quite a long time to protect the viewshed. Now in Richmond, we have a lot of scenic rivers that come through here, and most of our conservation easements do try to protect the rivers, whether it's through no-cut riparian buffers, through some of the historic properties, the James River plantations that are along the river. And so in this instance, you will see where we have state parks and other wildlife refuge areas along the river and private conservation easements. This view is to the east of Richmond, where again, you will see a combination of federal lands, local lands, private nonprofit lands, as well as private conservation easements, and how we are beginning to build and congregate those lands and protected status together and limited along the river here. But I think those corridors really do begin to add upon one another, as Kat showed you over time. One success leads to the next success. And downtown Richmond. Downtown Richmond is probably one of the most unique in that it has the James River Park system. This is 300 plus acres that is in a natural state that back in the 1960s, private individuals went and acquired much of this land and donated it to the city. There was great fear over time from the citizens that the city would ultimately sell it off to developers and that the natural state would then be turned into housing or condos or something else. And so back in 2000, there was the push to put a conservation easement on this land. You will see it is in green plus a hatch mark along it down here, as well as up here. And Capital Region Land Conservancy, along with a state agency, the Department of Conservation Recreation, another nonprofit in Richmond Foundation, hold the conservation easement on that. And I'm pleased to say that we're working with the city to add another 140 acres into that easement, which will provide additional scenic quality conservation along the river, mostly on the islands. Islands used to be privately owned, and there's still quite a few that are privately owned, including one called Vauxhall Island that was recently acquired. The largest island, called Williams Island, is about 100 acres. So those will be protected ultimately and will be important for the scenic views for those along the river. But I want to highlight probably our first scenic conservation easement that Capital Region Land Conservancy did. And when we talk about scenic easements, particularly from a scenic river, it's about being on the water looking back at the shoreline. That's really the value to most of the scenic easements when we talk about scenic rivers. But in this instance, we also had other scenic benefits that I will get into in a moment. But this view is looking at a conservation easement. In the foreground is the James River Park system that we hold the easement. And in the background, you will see just a few of these rooftops popping out, but we hold an easement that is basically in the foreground here that I will show you. This is the view from that property. This is a very important view to the community. It is an incredible view showing the downtown Richmond skyline along with the James River and a bridge from the 1920s that was built here connecting Bird Park, the Maymont estate, to then this easement area. Now, I will say from a crow's fly, this property is only about 4 miles from downtown Richmond. It's not a very far distance, but it does give one the sense that you are farther out. And that's one of the great things about our James River Park and the scenic benefits along the James River in downtown Richmond. A different view shows the same property under easement that was taken at Winter. And again, you will see the downtown skyline here. And then this is the Virginia World War I Memorial that is located in Bird Park. So a number of historic resources and incredible scenic views. And we're very grateful for the landowner who approached us to donate a conservation easement on this property. Now, when they did approach us, however, I must admit, a land trust does a lot of projects, mostly larger rural landscape projects. Well, we are a hybrid. We work in an urban center. We also work in those big rural properties. And this property is, frankly, it was 2 lots that were less than 3/4 of an acre each. And it was one of those where 2 different landowners were involved. They approached us about placing this as an easement. And we said, well, are they really even buildable? Is there a threat to the land that is going to prohibit this from being a protected viewshed? And in fact, they came back with certified engineering drawings. They showed the topography. They showed that there could be 2 5,000 square foot each home built here. We're in an area of the city of Richmond that has $1 million houses. And when you have views like that, they are pretty priceless. So it is one of those where we worked, now that we knew that it could be developed, to preserve the property and to preserve the view. Now, I mentioned earlier that the view from the river was important because of the scenic river designation, but Riverside Drive also had received a local scenic designation, and it is a scenic byway that has been designated by the city of Richmond. So again, those are the type of scenic values that we can protect in a conservation easement. And in this one, we did not create too much of a buffer off of the Riverside Drive because it was the views of the river that were important. Again, what I want to highlight here, and this is something that I think is important in Virginia, we now have something called Conserve Virginia. And one of the many layers, there are 7 different categories, but one of those is a scenic preservation category. And this was done through the Department of Conservation and Recreation, where they took a lot of inputs and determined what the highest 10% of land that needed protection was and where it was located. And under the scenic preservation category, you can see just exactly how much of that is in the Richmond downtown area. Most of this is due to it being along a scenic river designation because it's also got trails, public access. This is the Gillies Creek Trail. This is the Route 1 bicycle trail that is part of the Atlantic Coast Greenway. Now, when we were in Richmond trying to figure out also scenic views, and I credit a lot of this to Scenic Virginia and some efforts that were happening locally, but we received a great community project from the Virginia chapter of American Landscape Architects. Not only did they do viewshed analysis, but they basically completed a community process that ranked and polled the residents of Richmond as to where do we need to be looking to protect our views? What land needs to be protected? What land needs to be screened? So in some ways we were doing what Monticello had resources to do, what Mount Vernon had resources to do, but this was being done frankly as a community project, as a gift to the citizens of Richmond, which we were very grateful for. And through that, through a series of community charrettes, through a number of both in-person workshops and online efforts, we had the ability to document where the citizens and what the historic views along the James River were that needed to be protected. On the left here, you see just stickies and arrowed stickies so that people could angle their arrow precisely for how their version of the view was angled. And then to the right, you will see those views that received the highest priorities. Now, I want to share one view in particular that was the highest priority view in many ways. But before we get there, this is more of that analysis of how they aggregated the different views and layered them so that we could see where the hot spots were. where the multiple benefit of placing easements would enhance multiple view sheds. So that was a great analysis. And of course, you've seen similar images like this from CAT when you do the LiDAR scan and show where the tree canopies are hitting. This is a different view, and this again goes to where view sheds overlay and where those hot spots are and what could be the areas to protect. So this example shows basically a lot going on Belle Isle. This is Route 1 crossing the James River, a very old crossing, and you get a lot of intensity here. You've got the view from the Virginia War Memorial, etc. But I'm going to share a little bit more down here where we have another hot spot. This was an area for the view from Libby Hill Park. Now, a little bit of background. Libby Hill Park was acquired by the city of Richmond in 1851. It was one of the very first parks that the city acquired. And when it was written in the newspaper, the city said that it was acquiring parks in Libby Hill for breathing spaces, that they wanted to allow people to get out and breathe fresh air. And we're talking antebellum here. But the view from Libby Hill had pretty much existed for quite a number of centuries and had never been threatened. And any time that it had been threatened, the Richmond City Council basically had shut it down. Well, in 2013, there was an effort from a private landowner who had acquired land within the view shed. And this was the proposal. As you can see, it is a very tall building, and they had done some analysis to show exactly how it would disrupt the view that named Richmond. Now, why is the view that named Richmond important, and what do we know about it? The series that the ASLA did went back and created a timeline, a view shed timeline of historic images, not just saying, oh, this is a pretty view if you stand at this point today, but it was a view that was pretty to hundreds and thousands of people for the past centuries. And it is the subject of many paintings and photographs and watercolors. I just share with you a few samplings of them. Photographs of Richmond after the Civil War that were very important, that documented the landscape. They were turned into postcards to promote Richmond. They were used as illustrations in books about Richmond. And so for hundreds of years, we had seen the view that named Richmond as being an icon of our landscape, a defining image of what Richmond and Richmonders feel like. So here again, 1965 is the view that named Richmond, and 2012, the view that named Richmond. So as you get this sense for a very long period of time, dating back to presumably when William Byrd named Richmond, we've identified with this view. Well, in 2013, when there was yet another development proposal, citizens came back and lobbied against it. And it's important when we do conservation work to hear what the citizens want us to be doing. So what they had really concerned about was 3 sites that if we didn't address site 1, which was the 2013 proposal, well, what about these other sites? Fortunately, all 3 of these sites are now under some form of protection or working to some form of protection. So I've jumped to the end on that. But site 3 was actually a historic easement on a historic structure that in fact covered land. So we know that we're protected on site 3. Site 1 I will talk about as a conservation easement that the Capital Region Land Conservancy recorded last year, and site 2 will kind of be my closing. So when we're looking at the view from Libby Hill Park, this is the vantage from the monument that is at the top. And what we did was we did that cross-property analysis that Kat showed, where you basically take your view and what is in the view and what is out of the view. And so we drew our straight line down to the river to determine exactly what the view would be. And we did that analysis with all of the elevations associated with the property that we were talking about placing under an easement, to determine, in fact, whether or not an easement should be placed on the property and to what degree was a development on the property, you see a structure here, would impair the view that named Richmond. So we did that analysis. the property owner, in fact, did an analysis as to what the by right development of the property was, so that we could in fact see from engineering perspective as well as from a zoning perspective exactly what could be built. And here you see that it was a 7-story building on top of a 2-story parking deck that could be built on this site, which is only 3/4 of an acre, but it's in downtown Richmond. And the highest and best use here was for a hotel concept. So we said, yes, it can be developed. It is a threat to the view, and we will protect it with a conservation easement. Now, somebody might say, well, you do a conservation easement, that makes sense, but this is downtown. It doesn't have any agricultural soils. It doesn't have any forestry values. It should have some other use. So in our discussion, and this is where Kat also referenced, every easement is different. It's a negotiation between the land trust and the landowner. And in this instance, this property owner was willing to gift development rights to a 7-story structure in downtown Richmond. And all he asked for was a surface parking lot. Now, that's a little strange, but ultimately the surface parking lot reduces impervious surface that was already on the property. All of the runoff goes through best management practice stormwater drainage. We have only native plants, and there's a list that is provided from DCR that could be planted on the property. Back to Kat's point about how do you address dark sky. So being that this was a view shed easement, only dark sky lighting can be used on this property, so that we are trying to protect those view shed values. I will say one last benefit of the native plants that we worked with the landowner on. Every single tree and plant that got put into here is a pollinator, and it also is bearing fruit. So it's going to feed the bird population, and there could be forage food as well. So I think that those are a whole host of different values that one can bring into an easement, even if you are doing a scenic easement. So here's what the property looked like as an overgrown, basically landfilled site. And here's what the property looks like today after the conservation easement. Now, I will say the landowner got really excited since this picture was taken, and he went and he painted over all the little white stripes in the parking lot. He painted them green. He thought he had done the most incredible conservation effort ever. And he figured that if he painted them green, that then you wouldn't see the white stripes so much from the view. So, I mean, you get landowners who get really energized and excited about placing conservation easements. Well, I'm going to jump to that other site I mentioned and share that while we did a conservation easement on this one property, not everybody is willing to donate an easement. And just as Monticello had to do, sometimes you have to bring money to the table, and you got to bring a lot of money to the table. And Capital Region Land Conservancy, and I probably should be a little bit quiet about this because I don't want to take away any major announcement, but tomorrow at 1 o'clock, Mayor of Richmond, Mayor Stoney, is going to be announcing that Capital Region Land Conservancy has a contract to now purchase 3011 and 3021 Dock Street. Now, that was the other site that was the threat to the view shed. What's more important about this site, and this goes back to our scenic rivers, this is immediately on the river. This has 800 feet of riverfront, and it has about 400 feet of dock that will provide in the future the first dock for private citizens to bring a boat into Richmond. All the other boat docks nearby are in Henrico County, and they're private slips. So this will allow for regular boaters to come up and potentially dock for the day. But nevertheless, I share with you, this is the base of Libby Hill Park. This is the 3/4 of an acre conservation easement prior to all of our work. And then this is 5.2 acres of land that we have under contract. What's also really great about this is the ability to connect people to the river. This property is owned by the city of Richmond. This property is owned by the city of Richmond. This will create one long linear park. And this is the historic ship lock into the Kanawha and Canal ship lock or canal system that George Washington had a major role in and was a major investor in. And the locks that are here are adjacent to the property that we're acquiring, and those locks were put in 1854. They are the most current locks that are there. And this is more views that I think are important to show, where the public will continue to be able to have views of downtown Richmond, views across the river, where again, this is city-owned land. And what's interesting is that the city-owned land on the other side of the river is part of the Richmond Slave Trail. This is a walking trail that was put in. This is the first stop along the walking trail that will give visitors the experience of an enslaved person arriving in the Richmond docks to be either sold at the slave auctions that were very prominent in Richmond, or to be shipped off to another farm working environment. And the property that we are acquiring is this entire stretch here. So it's an important view back over to the historic Tobacco Row and Libby Hill. So while we can use easements, sometimes we have to go into land acquisition. Now, this is a different tool, and I know I'm going to check my time, Kat, because I know I'm long too, but this is something that the city of Richmond has been proposing. Currently, it's not allowed under state law, and I know Scenic Virginia is looking to change something about that, but this would be something called a scenic overlay district. We have overlay districts, but a scenic one hasn't yet really hit the books for what we could do. But the city of Richmond, through its master plan, had identified that there should be efforts to protect the view, and they have their own definition of the view, but this is a draft of a view shed overlay district that the city would then propose to put into its master plan. And the conical shape here, it abruptly ends because this is Henrico County, so the city can't affect much in Henrico County. And most of the land that is in this conical shape is mostly city-owned. This is city-owned, and this is city-owned. And now, as you see, what we're working on here is city-owned. The property that we have under easement is this corner here, and then the purchase property is all of this down here, just to give you a sense. Now, I want to segue a little bit to a different type of working on easements and scenic values. We're very fortunate to have the first national water trail that was created, the Captain John Smith Trail, and much of the tidal James River up to the portion that I showed you at Dock Street is part of that National Park Service water trail. And so it allows for us to do scenic easements along the James River in sections that aren't really part of a scenic river designation. And so this is a property along the Captain John Smith Trail in eastern Henrico County. It's an aerial view. The river is at the bottom left corner, and you'll see kind of a floodplain up to a ridge. It's all agricultural land, and it's only about 50 acres, but it's within 10 miles of the city of Richmond. And we put an easement on it, and I'm sharing with you an illustration from our baseline documentation report that shows precisely how we did a no build along the river that would protect the scenic values for people who were potentially boating on the river. And also, because of this being close to National Park Service land, being close to scenic roads, and the idea of keeping a setback for those scenic values, we also put a no build area in the front of the property. Now, I will say, back to Conserve Virginia, for this particular property, met the Conserve Virginia scenic values. It also met the Conserve Virginia agricultural values. It met the Conserve Virginia flood and flood resiliency values for climate change and sea level rise. And lastly, it met the Conserve Virginia cultural and historical preservation, because this is technically within the battlefield of Deep Bottom 1, Deep Bottom 2, and Newmarket Heights. All three battles were where US colored troops fought. The Battle of Newmarket Heights is where 14 were awarded Medal of Honor. So very important sacred land when we talk about historic preservation. But as you can see, there's also National Park Service land adjacent, and this is a road that goes through National Park Service land called Hoke Brady Road. These are actually earthworks from the Civil War along the road. And the National Park Service really just has a sliver of a section of the property. So you can see on their interpretive map how that road works and then how it meanders through, and it's really not well buffered, but it is part of their interpretation of the Civil War. And so part of what we've been doing is to also create conservation easements adjacent to the National Park Service properties and adding more buffer. Currently, the Park Service only had, I think, a 30-foot buffer that they owned from that roadway. And so we now have a 300-foot buffer in conservation easements that make it so that any building might not be viewed. And lastly, and I think this is an important conversation, in any easement now, you have to define where the build areas are. And so we made sure that those build areas were well enough protected from the roadways. So that's how conservation easements can work both on scenic views, on scenic rivers, and on scenic roads, whether they are on the federal level, on the state level, or the local level. So with that, I'm going to open it up and let Kat jump back in, and we'll go through and answer any questions if we have time left.
And of course, being the last speakers on the third day, we completely understand if everybody's going, we want to go on the field trip and drink beer.
Yes.
Yeah, so we still have about 5 minutes until the next sort of wrap up happens in the James City room for everyone who's here. You know, I thought I knew what was going on, and you guys just informed me about a whole new other set of stuff that's going on. So I'm really thrilled and grateful for you all for providing this background and information. And I really appreciate you all talking about the Conserve Virginia, because I think, you know, we are the first state to do that, and I think other states may be following, and to be able to show how you can actually use that kind of data for conservation easements and that sort of thing, I think is fabulous. So I want to thank you a lot for that. I think it's really fun personally to see all that you all are doing. So I want to thank you very much for that. We don't seem to have any questions. I would say my question is, when you all are going through these negotiations, even though scenic may be not the primary reason, do you have any pushback from those that you're working at with, if you want to address scenic?
I will share that a lot of the times they do want the scenic value protected. It's been their land. They appreciate those views and they want that protected. I think sometimes the pushback can be when, you know, we're talking about, well, what is scenic to whom? Is it the view from the river, or is it the view from the land? And it's very clear in the state code that it is views to the property, views from the property, and views across the property that can be protected. So it doesn't even have to be the property itself that you can see something else from. It could just be the fact that somebody could see across your property and it's an important view shed.
What Parker said.
I'm going to pipe up with a question, and it's probably more to Parker since he works more in this space. But Parker, you're aware that PEC works in some towns and villages where we're investing and helping, with the help of the Commonwealth, do some parks and recreation opportunities. And one of the concerns we're starting to have is that often when you're working in former marginalized communities and improving their recreation access, we're increasing the heat for gentrification. And I'm wondering what you think, how we can ring fence that sometimes so that we don't create another problem by trying to solve an older problem.
Yeah, great question. Not really a scenic river presentation.
But looking at some of the places where you have a scenic river work.
So first and foremost, I will just simply acknowledge that most of the riverfront in Virginia has been privately owned by very wealthy landowners. To
Absolutely.
be able to acquire 5.2 acres in downtown Richmond from the private sector to give it to the people is part of that work. This is in Richmond's East End, where population is growing, and we have 4 of the largest public housing complexes, and kids don't know a thing about the river. To be able to provide a dock to get kids or adults, anybody, down to the water. But back to your point, how do you provide a ring around gentrification from new parks and open space? That's a huge issue that everybody is trying to address as we provide equity. The biggest thing, I think, is to make sure that, frankly, we're working with those neighbors. There could be ways that the General Assembly would allow for new provisions that as we create this equity work, that there's a homestead provision for landowners who are benefiting where they're not going to be priced out of their community. I know from Richmond, we've looked at a lot of different ways of reducing the real estate tax liability for our seniors and our elders and those that are disabled, people who've really been in their homes for 30 or 40 or 50 years even. So there's that kind of a tool. Land conservation, I unfortunately don't think can really play a tool unless we go down the path of also working with our community land trust. And in Richmond, we have the Maggie Walker Community Land Trust that, while I was on council, helped set up. They hold the land. The improvement is sold between the quote unquote homeowner. And so that's a way that if we could combine the efforts of protecting parks and creating affordable housing at the same time, that's a real possibility. I will say right now in Richmond, as we're doing our park equity program, we've got a property where we could not raise the funds to purchase it. It's about 18 acres inside the city. And so we're talking about raising some of the money and partnering with the developer who is going to do affordable housing. And then we can create the park trail system with the adjacency. So, I mean, you just have to find different creative ways of matching it up.
Fair enough. Thank you.
John.
I think that's a really important point to make, Parker, is how do you be creative and how do you think outside the box and still work within the box, right? Because there's lots of rules and regulations and laws that have to be worked with, not necessarily around, but worked with, but in creative new ways. So I think you both shared with us some really exciting ideas about that, and I'm really grateful for that. And given our time, I'm going to say goodbye, and hopefully you all will go to the James City room and see everything. Thank you.
Good job, Kat. Thank you, everyone.
Good job, Parker. Goodbye, everybody. Take care.
Good job, both of you.